How's everybody doing today? How many of you are feeling really confused and frustrated and lost and maybe feeling a little guilty that nobody? Oh, one, okay. That you've made a mess of your Lightroom catalog. That's right, we're going to fix most of those problems here today. Hopefully all of them. So welcome. We're going to talk about Lightroom, sort of talk about common mistakes and more importantly how to resolve some of those common mistakes. And how many of you have not yet gotten started with Lightroom? A few of you. You are the lucky ones. Because you guys get to learn from the rest of us in terms of what things to avoid, how to make sure you don't fall into some of these traps of creating a mess in your Lightroom catalog. Those of you that have already gotten started with Lightroom, anybody feel that their Lightroom catalog is pristine, just totally perfect? You're mostly here just to show off and acknowledge that you've never had any of these issues that we're going to talk about today? No? Maybe there's one or two out there. So we're going to talk about some of the common issues and more importantly how to avoid them, how to resolve them. First, I want to give you a little bit of an overview. I think most photographers by now are at least a little bit familiar with Lightroom and how it operates. I think a big part of the reason that photographers run into trouble with Lightroom is that they don't stop and think about how Lightroom is different from other software that they've used in the past. And in fact, different from most software that's out there for managing your images. And to me, that's one of the core reasons that you would want to use Lightroom in the first place. Lightroom is a complete workflow solution that enables you to organize, optimize, and share your photos. But for me, the most important thing is the organization. Yes, of course, I want to share my photos so everybody can tell me how great they are. And every now and then, I might have a photo that needs just a teeny tiny little bit of adjustment if it wasn't quite perfect out of the camera. But really, it's mostly about getting organized so that when I want to have a photo, when I want to share a photo, that I actually can find that photo. So let's take a quick look at how Lightroom is structured. I think most of you are aware, Lightroom being a workflow-oriented tool, it's divided into modules that are based on your actual workflow. So up here on the top panel, we have the module picker over on the right side, and you can see there we have the library module. That's where we're going to be spending our time today. The library module enables us to organize our photos. And then we have the develop module for optimizing our photos or changing the appearance of our photos. The map module, which is also related to organization. If you travel a lot in your photography, as I do, you'll love the map module because you can literally put your photos on the map so that you know where your pictures were taken, or for me, perhaps most importantly, you can actually find photos based on where they were captured. And then the modules that I refer to collectively as the sharing modules, that's book, slideshow, print, and web, for sharing our photos, obviously in various ways, as printed books via blurb, etc. So again, we're going to focus on the library module, and that's where we're really dealing with our Lightroom catalog. So this is where we start to get into some of the differences when it comes to Lightroom compared to other applications that you might use for viewing your photos. I would say before Lightroom, most software out there for organizing your photos, and actually to this day I would say most of the applications out there are what I would refer to as browsers. Meaning you launch the software, you point to a folder, the software looks at that folder and says, look, here's what's inside. If you totally change the contents of a given folder, then the next time you point that software to the folder, everything looks different because it's just looking at that folder each time. Lightroom is different in that it uses a central catalog. It uses a central database to track the information about your photos. So you can sort of think of it as a 3-ring binder where you've listed out every picture you ever took. And then let's go back to the slide days, because remember film, wasn't that so much fun? And then we've got filing cabinets full of slide sheets that are in hanging filing system in that filing cabinet. And so you could have this notebook and you could flip through. Well, I mean, really, you'd have an intern do this for you, right? So you would just say, I need a picture of an elephant. And they would flip through until they found elephant. Oh, that's in, cabinet number 4, drawer 3, and it's halfway back, or, whatever your system might have been. And so you could actually find an image. Well, the 3-ring binder was separate from the slides in your drawers. We had organization plus the actual content. It's the same way in Lightroom. We have a catalog where Lightroom, your virtual assistant as it were, is keeping track of the information about your images, and then we have the actual images. Now, perhaps the most important thing here to keep in mind is that means once you've imported the photos from your hard drive, for example, into your Lightroom catalog, that does not mean you can then go delete the images off your hard drive. Now, when I say that, usually everybody kind of chuckles a little bit. Ha ha ha, of course I can't delete my photos. I know photographers who have done this. It's a really scary thing. So let's take a look at those individual elements. I'm going to bring up my catalog settings dialog. We can find catalog settings on the Lightroom menu if you're a Macintosh user, or on the Edit menu if you're a Windows user. We'll take a look at a couple of those settings in just a moment related to the catalog. But first off, on the General tab, I'm just going to tap or click the Show button, which will bring up a dialog that shows me, a window in my operating system that shows me where my catalog is located. And the catalog, while that's a single entity, it's actually comprised of several individual files. And so if you notice here, I'm looking in a location called Photos 1, and a folder is highlighted. There's my Photos 1 catalog. That's the catalog I'm using right now for demonstration purposes. It's the currently open catalog in Lightroom. If I double click on that folder, then you'll see that I have a number of files associated with my actual catalog. Do you need to know about these files? No. Do you need to do anything to these files directly? No, in fact, I encourage you not to do anything to these files directly. Leave them alone, but be aware that they exist. This is your Lightroom catalog. Specifically, I have my LRCat file. You can see the LRCat extension for the file name there. That stands for Lightroom Catalog. And then I have LRData, Lightroom Data, that contains my previews. You don't need to worry about those specific aspects of these files, but I think it's helpful to understand that there are files essentially that Lightroom is using behind the scenes to manage your photos. These other files, by the way, are only there because Lightroom is currently running. They're sort of helper files, I suppose you could say. So that's my catalog. That's the information about my photos, but it's not my photos themselves. Those are stored in a different location. And in this case, for our purposes today, I'm going to use a couple of locations for specific photos. We'll talk about those momentarily. But you can see I have a folder called Photos 1 on my desktop. That is the folder where my Lightroom catalog is located. There is the folder that we were just looking at. But you'll also notice that I have some other folders here as well. And you might be able to tell from the titles of those folders that they include images. Perhaps images captured in Bratislava, Slovakia, for example, etc., etc. We'll talk about that folder structure shortly. But the point is, again, that we've got a catalog that contains the information about our photos, and then we have the photos themselves. Those are two things that we need to manage on some level. Now, the catalog itself, we don't really have to do too much to manage it directly, but we need to respect it. We're mostly just going to manage the catalog by using Lightroom in a responsible way. And by backing up our catalog, as you've probably already realized, Lightroom will offer weekly by default to back up your catalog. I highly recommend backing up your catalog if you're interested in keeping all the information about your photos. We'll talk more about that shortly, but the point is that that catalog can be pretty important to you as a photographer because it is the basis of all the information that you're going to have for your photos, metadata, keywords, star ratings, etc. In other words, without the catalog, it's going to be a lot more difficult to actually locate your images. And with the catalog, we're actually getting a tremendous advantage in terms of being able to find our photos. Because now, with a single catalog that we can search across, I can search for every single image that I've ever captured at an aperture of f/22 and a shutter speed of 1/500th of a second. I cannot think of a single reason why I would want to look for images with those criteria, but if I wanted to see those images, I could find them very, very quickly and easily. More to the point, if I want to see all of my best work, I don't have to try to make sure to keep a collection of photos organized, identifying them maybe with a keyword, for example, called best work. What's my best work? 5-star rated images. So Lightroom, show me every single picture I've ever captured. Not just all the images in a single folder, but every single picture I've ever captured, and now show me only those within that set that have a 5-star rating. Instant. Very quick and easy. And so that catalog gives us a lot of benefits, especially when we're looking for our photos. So coming back into Lightroom, some catalog settings. For the most part, we don't have to think too much about catalog settings, but there is a situation where I think it's important to actually maintain information separate from Lightroom's catalog. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One is interactivity with other applications. So for example, if I update keywords in Adobe Bridge, those keywords are not going to be visible in Lightroom. And if I update keywords in Lightroom, by default, those keywords will not be visible in Adobe Bridge. That's messy, and it could be a real big problem, which underscores one of the most important pieces of advice I could ever give you when it comes to working with Lightroom for managing your photos. And that is, once you are using Lightroom to manage your photos, you should only use Lightroom to manage your photos. Maybe you really like using Bridge because you've been using it for a while and it's a really cool piece of software with a cute little icon. But you do not want to use any software other than Lightroom for managing your photos once you're using Lightroom to manage your photos. Everything from an image management standpoint should begin inside of Lightroom. Yes, if you just want to browse your photos in Bridge or some other browsing application, that's perfectly fine, but be careful not to update the information because Lightroom then will be out of sync with the actual images on your hard drive. So everything should be done from within Lightroom. You want to rename photos? Do it in Lightroom. You want to rename folders? Do it in Lightroom. You want to move images around? Do it in Lightroom. Add keywords, add star, anything you want to do, start from Lightroom. It's probably the most important piece of advice I could give you. But I also like to have most of the information about my photos written out to the photos themselves. So remember, I've got the catalog containing information about my images, then I've got the images themselves. Well, wouldn't it be nice if we could sort of merge some of that and take the information and add it to the photos? Like my star ratings and my keywords, so that, heaven forbid, I should lose my Lightroom catalog, at least I have my most important information included with my photos themselves. Or if I should need to browse my photos directly for some reason using another piece of software, Adobe Bridge for example, I'll see that information. Well, we can save the metadata out manually. I personally prefer to have that done automatically, so that as I update metadata for my images, Lightroom automatically writes the information out to the files themselves. So again, in the catalog settings dialog, just to repeat, we access this dialog by choosing catalog settings either from the Lightroom menu on Macintosh or the edit menu on Windows. I'm going to go to the metadata tab, and in the editing section you'll see this checkbox, automatically write changes into XMP. This is turned off by default. I have to assume the reason it's turned off by default is for performance. If I select 10,000 images and add a keyword to 10,000 images all at once, Lightroom has to update 10,000 files on my hard drive, and that could slow things down a little bit. I'm willing to take a little bit of degraded performance in the interest of having that information, number one, backed up, so that if I lose my Lightroom catalog, I don't have to worry about it too much, but also having that information available to other applications. Keep in mind, however, that not all of the information in your Lightroom catalog can be written out to the image files themselves. Not all information can be written out to your actual image files, and that's because some of the information inside of Lightroom is Lightroom specific. It is non-standard metadata. So for example, collections. If you use collections to organize your photos, that's perfectly fine, but standard metadata fields don't know anything about collections, and so there's no way for Lightroom to put that information into the actual image files themselves. The history of what you've done in the develop module also will not be written. Pick flags or reject flags, if you've made use of those are not written out because all of these things are not standard metadata. The develop module settings actually can be written out. That's a little bit of an exception, but that information can be written out so that you'll see the effect of those changes in other software. Well, other Adobe software, because the software needs to know about the specific things that the develop module does. But then if you browse an image in Adobe Bridge, or if you were to open it directly in Photoshop, or via Adobe Camera Raw, for example, you would see the image as it appears in Lightroom because those settings will be respected. And so again, I prefer to turn on this checkbox to automatically write changes into XMP so that as I'm updating metadata within my Lightroom catalog, Lightroom is also saving that information out to my actual image files. And when I say actual image files, I don't really mean actual image files, unless they're TIFF or JPEG. Because in the case of RAW, of course, Adobe is concerned that you might not like them touching your original RAW captures. You might be a little paranoid about software messing with those files, and so in the case of RAW captures, that'll actually go into an XMP sidecar file. It's just an XML file. And so that's the reference to XMP here. This might lead you to assume that this setting only relates to raw captures. That's not the case. It will update the metadata for TIFF and JPEG, basically for any images that are supported by Lightroom. If you're including video in your Lightroom catalog, it's worth noting that video doesn't support metadata in the same way that images do. And so you can add keywords to videos inside of Lightroom, for example, but it's not going to be saved out to the actual image file. So if you browse your video clips, for example, in another application, you won't see any of those keywords. So you can use Lightroom to organize your videos, you just can't send that information out to the video files in a way that is accessible to other software. It's worth noting, by the way, that we also have down at the bottom here an option to write date and time changes directly to the proprietary raw files. Now, I'm usually a pretty paranoid guy. This is one exception. I think it's just that I'm paranoid. So I'm very worried that my images are going to be damaged if I let Lightroom, for example, update my raw capture, my original raw capture. But what I'm more concerned about is somebody finding out that I forgot to change the time on my camera. And so I forgot to mention, hypothetically speaking, actually, I forgot to, I always forget to put that, well, not always, sometimes I forget to add, hypothetically speaking, if I were to ever forget to change the date or time on my camera when I cross a time zone, for example, then I would want to hide the evidence. I'm not suggesting that's ever actually happened to me, but hypothetically speaking, then this would cause the raw capture to be updated. I'm okay with that, recognizing there's a certain risk, but also I would never perform this step if I didn't have an existing backup of my images. So with a little bit of caution, I think it's okay. Matter of personal preference, though. I guess the question then too is how important is it that the date and time of capture be accurate? I know some photographers have adopted an approach, for example, where they'll set the clock on their camera always to Greenwich Mean Time or to Universal Coordinated Time, so that it's always fixed. They never have to think about time zones. The problem is then I never know what time it is. So I prefer to use local time. I try to make a point of changing the time on my camera when I'm crossing time zones. This can be a little tricky when you know transatlantic flight, and as you cross each time zone, you've got to update your camera settings. No. But once I land, I try to make a point. Even sometimes I'll change the time before I head to the airport just to try to make sure that I set the time correctly. But if I were to ever forget, personally, I want the information updated in the actual files themselves, the original raw captures, even though there's a certain risk there. All right. So that's kind of Lightroom in a nutshell in terms of the overall architecture, as it were, and the settings that I think are important. We're going to talk about a few of the various issues that I think photographers run into. If you're already a subscriber to Gray Learning, my video training library, then you might recognize some of this as being included in a course that I've got available there. So if you're already a subscriber, you can just go check out the course. What is it called? Resolving Organizational Challenges. It's a Lightroom 5 based course, but it all applies to Lightroom 6. And so much of what we're going to talk about today, I'll reference back to this index just for continuity, I suppose. And if you're not a subscriber, you certainly are encouraged to sign up. But let's start off with one of the most common issues that photographers run into, and let's figure out who's to blame. Who do you suppose is to blame when photos go missing in Lightroom? Adobe or Apple or anybody but you? Yeah. So there's a few things. The most common issue that I think you're going to find is situations like this where you'll see an indication, and we get differing indications depending on where we are, and in some respects, which version of Lightroom you're using. On the film strip down below here, you'll notice, or you might be able to see, that at the top right corner of each image, there's a little exclamation point. I get a preview here though. Even though the image is missing, Lightroom can still show me the photo. Thank you, Lightroom. Remember that LR data file that contains all these previews? Those previews enable me to view my photos even when I don't have my external hard drive connected to the computer, for example. So that's pretty nice, but I can't work in the develop module, for example, unless I've created a smart preview. That gives me an alternate way to work with my images. But in this case, I don't have smart previews, so Lightroom just says the file cannot be found. What have you done? And I'm sure it's my fault. Now, I should hasten to point out, of course, all of the issues that I'm demonstrating today, I created them myself intentionally for educational purposes only. My Lightroom catalog, my real Lightroom catalog, of course, is totally organized and pristine. I just want to make sure that we were all aware of that. But here we have some images that are missing. Again, we've got a number of thumbnails down here. If I switch to the grid view, you can see that each of the thumbnails there also has that exclamation point. But in this case, perhaps more importantly, is that each of the folders here, and we have a couple folders, we'll talk about those a little later, each of those folders has a little question mark associated with it, which is to say, it's not so much that the photos are missing, I mean they are, but it's not so much that the photos are missing, it's that the folder is missing, and the folder of course contains a bunch of photos. That's not always the case, but at the moment with this specific set of images, that is the case. So we have a folder that is missing, and therefore the images inside cannot be found. Most often, I know sometimes I'm sure it has nothing to do with you. Maybe there was, solar flare activity or, a power surge or some other issue. But most of the time, in my experience, this is because a photographer didn't obey my first and most important piece of advice related to Lightroom, in that everything should be done inside of Lightroom. And instead, they went out into the operating system or into Adobe Bridge or whatever the case might be, and they renamed a photo or they renamed a folder or they moved a folder or moved some files or whatever the case might be. So let's figure out what happened. Well, I'm going to show you what happened because, of course, I would never make a silly mistake like this without doing it for purely educational purposes for your benefit. I have this folder called New York City on my primary storage location. This happens to be this folder called Photos 1. And you can see that inside of Lightroom, Lightroom thinks that that folder is called NYC. But on the hard drive, it's called New York City. Because at some point I had the brilliant idea that some people might not know what NYC was, and so I should put New York City instead, so I just renamed the folder. The folder itself still contains those subfolders. You can see after sunset and before sunset, for example. And inside of each of those folders, you see my raw captures plus my XMP sidecar files so that all my keywords, etc., are sort of backed up and visible to other applications. So all that stuff is there. Whew, that's a sigh of relief. I haven't actually lost my images, I've just confused Lightroom. And so I can change that very easily. Of course, out on my hard drive, I could change it back to NYC and it will magically reappear. But actually, I think it probably makes more sense because when I'm looking for photos that were captured in New York, I'm probably going to go look alphabetically under New, as in New York, as opposed to NYC. And so I think actually this name is a good name. I just changed it in the wrong place. Well, let's go fix it. If I right-click on that missing folder, then I can choose the option to find missing folder. So I'll go ahead and choose that option, and then I will navigate out to the location where that folder is located, and I will identify, or click on, that specific folder. In other words, I'm saying to Lightroom, yeah, sorry, but you know that NYC folder? I went out on my own and renamed it, but here it is. And it could be called anything at this point. I'm just reconnecting the dots, telling Lightroom, that file that you're looking for in that location, this is where it is, or that folder in this specific case. It probably goes without saying, but it's very, very important to pay attention to detail in this situation. We want to make sure that we reconnect the correct folder with the correct folder and not exacerbate the problem by trying to reconnect the wrong folder. But I'll go ahead and choose that option. You notice that New York City over here is magically changed. So it was NYC, now it says New York City, and now I have those images that are no longer missing. So you don't see, for example, the exclamation point at the top right corner. When I go into the develop module, it no longer says the file cannot be found. I feel better already. How about you? How many of you are going to go home and do this a little bit tonight to reconnect some missing folders? All right, another issue, a little bit more messy issue. So now we've got a situation where my Spain folder, Spain 2013, is not missing. It's right where Lightroom thinks it should be. And in fact, if we come back out onto the hard drive, you'll see there it is. Again, that catalog just referencing what's out on the hard drive, keeping track of things for me. Well, so what's the problem, Lightroom? Let's open up and we'll see, the images are right there. The images are right there. I don't understand what the problem is. I can see all the photos. So I don't know what Lightroom is complaining about. Oh wait, if we look down here, can you see that underscore MG underscore 8530, for example, for the currently selected image? Well, that's the file name in Lightroom. That's what Lightroom is looking for. If we look out on the hard drive, you'll see it's Spain 0001, Spain 0002. Now, admittedly, the file names on the hard drive make a lot more sense versus the file names that the camera assigned. However, I renamed outside of Lightroom. And boy, I hope that the files were sorted in the exact same order. In this case, they're sorted by capture time. See if we sort by file name, if we get a little better luck here. Oh, thank goodness. Okay, so this isn't going to be horribly awful, but it is not going to be fun either. I certainly hope that Lightroom will recognize all these other images somehow magically, but I wouldn't hold my breath, because now I've renamed all of these images to something completely different. I didn't include the original file name in my new file name. There's really nothing to reconnect these images except me. Now I need to be extra careful, because now it's possible, depending on how I had my images sorted when I renamed them, it could have been random. It could have been based on star rating, could have been based on my mood at the time, could have been based on all sorts of things. Fortunately, it looks like it was based on the original file name as opposed to the capture time. So, for example, you can see that now Spain 0001 relates to the first image on the film strip. So now how do I reconnect that individual image, not the folder, but the image? Well, I can click on that little exclamation point, and it tells me what it's looking for. So I can locate. Well, I can navigate to that location. I'm going to switch to my thumbnail view here, because in this case, I'm really going to need it, because I need to make absolutely certain that I'm reconnecting the correct images. Otherwise, I'm going to have a real mess on my hands, a bigger mess than I already do in Lightroom. So this happens to be the image itself. Fortunately, you can see they're sorted in the same order right now, so that makes my job a little bit easier. I have this option to find nearby missing photos. Let's all cross our fingers and see what happens. So Spain 1 has a different file name. Yeah, thanks, Lightroom, for rubbing it in. But I'm going to confirm. And now let's see what happens with all our other files. Still missing. Now, Lightroom actually is capable of a recursive reconnection. Those are really fancy words. But what that means is when I identify, let's say that I had changed the volume label on my hard drive, or for Windows users, changed the drive letter for my hard drive, so that every single folder on that hard drive appears to be missing. In that situation, when I reconnect one folder out of the dozens, perhaps, or more that are missing, Lightroom will, in most cases, find all of the others as well. It will say, oh, you moved it to a different, you went from drive D to drive E, or you went from a photos drive to a Tim's photos drive, or whatever the case might be. Lightroom's smart enough to say, oh, okay, I'm looking for these folder names and these photo names, etc., and it can figure that all out. And most of the time, it will recursively, meaning going back and going through all the other folders, figure it all out and clean up your mess for you. When you've renamed the photos out on the hard drive, in most cases, that's not going to be possible. Lightroom just can't confirm that the two things match up to one another. So now I've got to go choose the second image. Yes, I know it's missing. Now I've got to locate it. It's image number 2. Select confirm. So just give me about 10-15 minutes here, and I'll get all of these reconnected. As you can see, it's a it's a very simple process. Very simple. Click, 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 and I'm done with one more image. Now in this case, how many images do I have? 68 photos. I've taken care of 3, so just 65 more of this click, 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 click business. Really simple. It is simple and frustrating and annoying. And so please don't get yourself in this mess in the first place. And don't rename your photos out on the hard drive. So I'm obviously not going to spend the extra time to actually reconnect all these, but you can see how that process works. Straightforward, but a little bit time consuming. Best avoided in the first place altogether. So another issue that I see photographers running up against is the old date-based folder. Oh man. Who thought this was a good idea? I mean, there are some, who thinks it's still a good idea? And is willing to admit it, even though I've just kind of like made it clear that I'm gonna.
With events.
Yeah, with events, it's good. If you're a photojournalist, probably good.
Yeah.
Probably good. If you're a street photographer, and every day you just get up out of your apartment, you head down onto the streets of New York City, and you photograph whatever you find, and it's random and different every day, I've got no solution for you other than a date-based structure, because what else are you gonna do, right? But for most of us, a date-based folder structure doesn't make a lot of sense, only because if you're anything like me, I don't even know what day it is today, let alone when was I in Spain, or whatever the case might be. I can't remember by date. I'd be lucky to get it right on a decade basis. So my accuracy there's not going to be very good. I'm usually, for me personally, thinking based on location. Not always, but usually based on location. Wedding photographers, anybody? Are there no wedding? Oh, they were a little slow. They thought I was going to give them a hard time. I am envious. I mean, not really, because I don't want to deal with the stress of photographing weddings. I'm envious of wedding photographers, though, because their organizational system is so easy. Don't tell them that, but the organizational system is so easy. It's just like the couple's name. Like when someone says, "Oh, hey, I need one of the pictures for my wedding," what's your name? Okay, now I'm looking at them. It was that easy. When I need a picture of a whale, I'm like, oh, was that in California on that whale watching trip, or Washington State, or Alaska? Like, I've got to actually do some thinking. With wedding photography, it's easy. If it's location-based, not so bad, as long as you can remember the location. But the point is that we're using a folder structure, ideally, that is well-suited to the way you think about your photos. If you're a wedding photographer, you're probably thinking about the bride and groom's name. If you're an event photographer, you're probably thinking either about maybe who's throwing the event, that maybe it's a company throwing the event, or the date of the event, whatever criteria is pertinent to you. Travel photographer, location. Street photographer, you're probably going to have to go by date. But I try to avoid dates in my folder structure unless it's necessary. That's not to say that I ignore the date. You'll notice in some of my folders, I indicate the year, for example, especially if I've been to the same place multiple times. I'll have the year and sometimes the month as part of that folder name structure, just to remind myself or to know which folder goes with which trip. But I don't like a folder structure that's based on dates, in large part because I can't remember what day it is. The problem is, when you start to get into a date-based folder structure, Lightroom seems to be trying to trick you and confuse you. So let me show you how that date-based structure typically gets approached. You might set up a folder based on, for example, the year that you're photographing. So you've got a folder for each year. Well, when we specify the location, we can actually organize by date. So that, for example, we'll have a year folder, then a month folder, then a day folder. Well, that makes perfect sense. Well, part of the reason I don't feel the need to have that level of granularity in my folder structure is that I can always filter in my Lightroom catalog, thank you very much, Lightroom, by day, or by several days, or by the whole month, or by the whole year, or whatever date criteria I choose to use. So I don't really need a folder structure for that purpose. So again, my recommendation is don't use a date-based structure unless the date-based structure actually helps you in your specific workflow and that the metadata, the capture time, is not adequate for that purpose. But we've got this by date option. Well, what happens when I'm importing into my year folder and then I choose the by date option? Lightroom, in its helpfulness, creates a new year folder for me inside the existing year folder. And so when we're using a date-based structure, we need to be very, very, very careful that we are creating that structure accurately. Otherwise, let's take a look at Bratislava. You run into a situation like this where I've got my Bratislava folder and I organize by date on import. So I've got a 2013 folder which contains no images. That's okay. It's because I'm going to have a month-based folder. Oh, well, there's my year, month, day folder, and then a year folder, and then a year, month, day folder, and then a year folder. I found some images. Anybody? Anybody ever have this? I know someone has. So yes, dates can be fine. And I like to give a hard time to people that use a date-based structure. Usually when I ask them, I ask how many people use a date-based structure, there's one or two. And then I ask them if they're an engineer. and like 80, 90% of the time they say yes, or they'll say no. I'm like, well, what are you? Well, I'm retired. Well, what were you before you retired? Engineer. So, there are people who have, the capacity for this, or just, have that intuitive sense where they're able to keep organized. I'm surprisingly able to keep organized by location, and some people are surprised that I can find images by you naming a subject. I can name a place and go find the folder for that place. To some people, that seems weird. To me, it seems weird to be able to stay organized by date. But again, if you're going to use that structure because it does work for you, that's perfectly fine, but be very, very careful. You can see the mess that we've got here in terms of nested, dated folders. So each of the day folders actually has images in it, but it's nested inside of another year folder. And so that creates a tremendous mess. Well, let's assume that we actually want to use a date-based structure, because I'm actually totally fine with that for you. I'm just not okay with it for me. So if dates work for you, that's perfectly fine. If you prefer to have your photos organized by date, that is absolutely fine. For our purposes, let's just live within the microcosm of this Bratislava folder, just to keep our work a little bit simpler, just for demonstration purposes. And so I'm going to just pretend like this little folder structure is all that we have. And so I want to retain this top level 2013 folder. In reality, if I was using date-based structure, I probably wouldn't even have the Bratislava folder. But we're just going to ignore that for the moment, just so we can see how this basic approach might work. And so this, we'll call that, well, it is, we don't have to call it, it is the March 8th folder is inside a 2013 folder. That's perfectly reasonable. But then we have another 2013 folder, and then we have the March 9th folder. Well, all I have to do, this is so simple, but I can't tell you how many times I'll demonstrate this and I'll get oohs and ahs from the audience that they're actually impressed that this is possible. For some reason, people think that this basic file management cannot be done inside of Lightroom, but it can. Watch, it's so simple. Just drag and drop. So I'm going to take that March 9th folder and I'm going to put it up into the 2013 folder. Lightroom, thank you, very polite, asks for confirmation. I'm actually moving files on my hard drive. Technically, I'm changing index entries, but let's not get into that. We're moving photos on the hard drive. That makes me a little nervous, because what happens when you move files from one location to another? In this case, it's on the same hard drive, so it makes me less nervous. But if you're moving from one hard drive to another, you're taking the files and removing them from one hard drive and then putting them on the other hard drive. What about that in between? And what if something goes wrong in that in-between? Makes me nervous. I don't like it. So I prefer to copy and then delete the original if I want to move. In this case, it's not an option. Again, I would normally have a really good backup of all my photos, so really the risk here is not tremendous. And in this case, it's on the same hard drive, so it's not that much of an issue in any event. So I'll go ahead and confirm that move operation. And what do we got inside? Someone was very impressed. So now we've got some additional folders. We've got the March 10th folder. I'll drag that up to that 2013 and confirm the move. Now I have some empty folders, which I will delete carefully. Now Lightroom will warn me if there are photos inside the folder. But how many of you have gotten into this sort of knee-jerk reaction sort of thing in your life? Like, I'll give you an example. You install a brand new piece of software, and what does it show you? The license agreement. And what do? You click accept. Anybody ever read a license agreement? Me either. I can only imagine what sort of stuff is hidden in there. We kind of have that reaction. Delete, yes, confirm. Delete, yes, confirm. It should be delete. Hold on, let me think about this for a minute. What else might happen if I delete these photos? Now, in fairness, these days we usually have the recycle bin on Windows or the trash on Macintosh, so we have a fallback, unless there's not enough capacity for that. But by and large, the risk is not necessarily huge, but I like to do a couple of things before I actually delete a folder. You can see the folder shows no images, but it's possible that there's a subfolder that is being hidden from view. So I like to click the little spinner there. You see a little triangle? When it's pointed to the right, that means that this folder is collapsed, so to speak. The folder structure has been collapsed. When it's pointing down, it means it's been expanded. So I click on it. You can actually see, if you look really closely, the ones that are expanded are solid triangles. The ones that are not expanded and that are empty are not only pointing to the right, but they're also dashed. They're made up of little dots as opposed to being solid. But I like to click because I'm weird and paranoid, just to make sure. Maybe, there was a bug and the triangle didn't show solid when it was supposed to. But it shows empty. I also like to double check that my filter on the library filter bar is set to none, or if I'm using the film strip filter up at the top right of the film strip, I like to make sure, in other words, that there's no filters being set so that I'm not deleting a folder, deleting images that are in the folder that I didn't know about just because I had a filter set. So I like to take a, some might call it paranoid, I just call it thoughtfully cautious approach. So I'm going to right click and remove the folder. Notice I didn't even get an alert because there was nothing inside of there. Right click, remove. And so now I have this cleaned up folder structure by date, because, equal opportunity. If you like the date structure, that's totally fine. So I've got March 8th, 9th, and 10th as individual folders. Obviously, in this case, I might actually want the year folder to be up at a top level, or, whatever the case might be. We could obviously move more folders around, but the point here is just to understand the concept of moving folders from one location to another. Now notice when I go to that top level folder, 2013 in this case, now again, I'm working inside of the Bratislava folder, but inside of that 2013 folder, there are no images. Anybody else just get like a little twinge of anxiety there? Wait, but I know there were photos. March 8th, 9th, and 10th, I was photographing in Bratislava. How can there be no photos? Well, it's because I'm not viewing images in the subfolders. Personally, I don't want to see images in subfolders when I'm clicking on a parent folder. When I click on 2013, I don't want to see every image from 2013 that's down below. I want to sort of have to go to a folder rather than going to the top level folder. Oh, but what if you want to see images contained in multiple folders? Here's the 8th, here's the 9th, here's the 10th. So the 8th has, a dozen images and 9 images in the 9th and 5 images, etc. Here's another little trick. I'll bet you at least 3 of you didn't know this was possible. Okay, I'll bet only 3 of you might have known it was possible. Let's put it that way. Shift click, I can select multiple folders on the folders list, and now I'm looking at all of the images contained within those, in this case, 3 folders. But if you want, you can also enable an option to show photos in subfolders. So that if I go to the, in this case, 2013 folder, then I'll see images that are in the March 8th, March 9th, and March 10th folders without having to select them. Personally, I don't like that approach because then it gets confusing. Wait, which images am I looking at right now? I thought this was an empty folder, or I thought this was, a folder that only contained certain images. Now I'm seeing a lot of stuff I wasn't expecting. So to me personally, it can get a little bit confusing, and so I prefer not to have this option turned on. But if you prefer it, it's perfectly fine. I can turn on the option to view images in subfolders, and now when I go to the 2013 folder, I'm seeing all of the images in those 3 subfolders. If I want to see only certain ones, then I have to click on the individual folders, but I can see all of them just by going to that parent folder. So matter of personal preference. I think the key thing is to be aware that it exists, and if you like having it turned on, that option turned on, be aware of that behavior so that when you're seeing images you weren't expecting, you know exactly why. All right. So taking that a step further, I'm going to kind of take this in both directions because you might have reason to perform both of these various tasks. So I'm basically going to undo something and then redo the original thing, which is basically undoing the undoing or something. What happens when you've got folders structured in a way that you don't want them? So the date example, in this case I chose, or in the preceding case I chose to retain the date-based folder structure and just clean up the folder structure. But what if you've created a folder structure that you don't really want? Maybe you created your own day-by-day structure for a given trip, or you created folders based on subject, and now you're just finding it too difficult to find the images from one trip by subject, so you just want to consolidate. Well, that's exactly what we've got here with this New York City folder. I have the after sunset and before sunset folders. Why I would need to do that, I don't know. I mean, I could just as easily just get online and use one of these fancy websites to figure out what time sunset was at that location on that date, and then filter my images, except it doesn't let me filter them by time, which I'm hoping someday they will, so that I can say. In fact, Lightroom, now that I think about it, shouldn't Lightroom be able to have a filter that just says, show me all the pictures that were taken between sunset and sunrise? That's not so difficult. I mean, if it had GPS coordinates for the photos, it totally could do that. And so they need to put that in version 7. Are you with me? Let's all write letters to our congressman. We're going to make this happen. But in this case, I did it manually. And so I have these images captured before sunset versus after sunset, and I've decided that makes no sense. It's not meaningful. I'm going to assign star ratings, and I'm going to pick and choose which images I want to see at any given time. So I just want to consolidate these. In a moment, I'm going to show you how to unconsolidate using the exact same example, just so that you understand that both options are indeed possible. So I've got my New York City folder. I want to take the after sunset photos and the before sunset photos and put them into New York City. Anybody ever wondered why it is that after comes before alphabetically? Am I the only one? Okay, sorry. I'm going to find somebody who has that same issue someday. So I'm going to consolidate. Very, very easy. We've already seen this behavior. It's just now we're working with individual photos as opposed to folders that contain photos. So now I'm just going to select all of the images. So I'm inside my before sunset folder. I'm going to make sure that I don't have any filters set, because I don't want to confuse myself later. So I'll make sure the filter is set to none up on the library filter, or if you've been using the library filter associated with the film strip, turn that option off down there. Then I want to select all images. Yes, of course, we can go up onto the menu and choose Edit, Select All, but I'm a keyboard shortcut fan, so Control-A on Windows, Command-A on Macintosh, and now just drag and drop. And again, being very careful. So I've selected a bunch of images inside this Before Sunset folder, and I want to very carefully drag and stop. Not drag and drop. Drag and stop. I've still got my mouse button held down. And the reason I drag and stop, now, I don't drag and stop long enough to have this long-winded explanation for you guys. At home, I would already have dropped. But I stop momentarily and confirm that I'm on the right folder. And the reason I stop and look and confirm is this convenient feature where when you drag up toward the top of the list, it starts scrolling away. Now, when the folder you're looking for is way up at the top of the list, you are so happy to have that feature. You just drag up near the top, and it keeps scrolling and scrolling and scrolling. What happens to me sometimes, maybe you've never had this experience, but I have it all the time, but I'm special. I see a folder up near the top of the list, and so I go up to that folder near the top of the list without realizing that just as I get my mouse into position, Lightroom has said, oh, let me scroll for you. And then it scrolls, and then I drop, and then I don't know where my photos are. So I drag and stop, make sure there's none of this convenient scrolling behavior, and then once I know that I'm on the correct target folder, then I will release the mouse. So stop, drop, drag, stop, and drop. I need to make like a t-shirt for that one. Nobody steal that idea until I've done it. Once again, that move confirmation, and now I've got an empty folder. What am I going to do with the empty folder? I certainly don't need it, so I can right-click and choose the remove option to remove that folder altogether. And then we get to the after sunset folder. Oh, this is easy. It's so much easier the second time because we know exactly what to do. Stop and drop, remove that empty folder. See how easy that was. And now all of my images, both before sunset and after sunset, have been consolidated into the same folder. So if you decide that you kind of made a little bit of a mess, you made things more confusing than you needed to, you can certainly consolidate. So I could have, if I changed my mind about the date-based structure, I could have performed this exact same task just with the dated folders, putting them into the Bratislava folder, for example, in that case.
If you drop in the wrong place, you can undo, right?
Yes, if you drop in the wrong place, you can undo. If you drop in the wrong place, it's generally not terribly difficult if you've gone beyond the undo step to go back. If you discover it later, you can go back in there. They're usually going to stick out like a sore thumb, especially if you sort by capture time. They'll all be collected at the beginning or at the end. So I usually don't admit. Actually, maybe I don't want to tell you that. Okay, fine. So like a day or two ago, I was looking for a specific image and searching and searching And I'm kind of stubborn. So once I am not successful at a goal, instead of saying, well, it wasn't that important, now I am bound and determined. So I was searching for a specific image. I knew this image, like I could draw a picture of it for you right now, except that I can't actually draw. But I know it was captured in the Palouse. It was a crop duster. It was really cool. You'll actually see it in the second session. You might even see it later today in this session, but great shot. At least I like it. You might not like it. I'm searching and searching and searching, and all I have to do is go to the right folder and filter based on star ratings, and I'll have that image because it's one of my favorites. I don't remember which year. I've been to the Palouse like, I don't know, 10 times or something. And so, yeah, but I can click on a few folders and I can find it. I turned off all the filters. I went through every single folder. It was driving me absolutely mad. I had a collection that included the photos. I didn't think of that initially. It's like an hour later. I go to the collection, boom, there's the photo. Palouse. It was captured in the Palouse, the farming region of eastern Washington state. Somehow it was in an Italy folder. Drag, stop, and drop. So, even sometimes I don't learn my own lessons. All right, so let's assume that we then want to divide these images. Now, this is arguably a really bad example, but it's a convenient example because we're already in this folder structure. We've already seen this whole before sunset, after sunset thing. But you might have a situation where you want to divide images based on subject matter. So, for example, a wedding photographer, you might want to separate images into folders based on ceremony versus reception or what have you. If you're on a trip, maybe you're taking a trip that's taking you to multiple countries or multiple states, and you want to divide things up. So there are a variety of reasons you might want to divide up your images that sort of go together, but you want to have some division between them. We'll just use this silly before sunset and after sunset example for our purposes. All right, so we need more folders. And how can we create folders? I know, I'll go out to the operating system where it's very easy to make a new folder, right? Now, you have to understand that there are people who are going to watch this on YouTube later, and they're not sure what the right answer is, because that should have been like this deafening roar of a no. No, Tim, you cannot do that. Do not go to out to the operating system and make a folder, because when you're using Lightroom to manage your images, everything has to start inside of Lightroom, right? Yeah. But you meant to make it really loud, right?
Yeah. Right, Tim?
Thank you. We got one there. So we can actually make folders right inside of Lightroom, which I think a lot of photographers aren't aware of either. So I'm going to go to my New York City folder. That's where I want to create a folder. More specifically, I want to create a subfolder. So I'm going to go up to the Folders section over on the left panel. Oh, wait, so folder, subfolder, what's the difference? Subfolder's in a folder, but can I make a folder that's inside another folder? Yes. So I can use the Add Folder option to add a subfolder. So what's the real difference? Essentially, the subfolder option will assume that you want to create a folder inside the current folder. In other words, a before sunset folder inside my New York City folder. Whereas the Add Folder option assumes nothing, basically. It just assumes you want to make a folder. Since, you chose Add Folder from the pop-up, it will present a dialog and say, where would you like to create this folder and what would you like to call it? But in this case, I want to use the Add Subfolder option because I want a folder inside the currently active folder. So I choose Add Subfolder. What are we going to call that? Before sunset, for example. Do I want to include the selected photos? Well, I mean, technically, yes, because the selected photo was captured before sunset, but I didn't know this option existed before I chose it. So now I have not previously selected the photos. Good to know for next time. Doesn't help me now, but it will next time, because I'm going to learn. So before sunset, I could include selected photos if I had previously selected them. And sometimes you'll have created those selections. You'll selected a set of images and say, I don't have a folder that I can drag and drop to. I need to make it. So it's a convenient option. I will use it for the next one. So I'm going to choose the Create option in this case. There's my Before Sunset folder, which contains no images. But now I can go to my New York City folder and all the way up through, Are we going to use, should we call that before or after sunset? Hold on, let's just check the time. No. We'll call that before sunset because, look at all the reflections in the building. It must be like just about to set. That's what we're going to assume anyway. Does anybody remember which folder it was in originally?
It was in the app.
Was it in after? Now I'm torn. But somebody else said it's before. We're just going to go with before. So I'm going to drag, stop, and drop, and I'm going to move those images into that subfolder. So there's my before sunset folder. And now I'll go back to my New York City folder. Once again, click that little plus icon and choose the add subfolder option. Oh, actually, now I'm going to cancel because I made a point of saying I was going to learn. So now I'm going to learn to learn, apparently. So I'm going to select those images. So click on the first image, hold the shift key, and click on the last image. And now I will choose that option to add a subfolder inside the New York City folder. We'll call this After Sunset. And now I can include Sunnet. Some people spell it differently. Thank you. So after sunset, not sunnet. And then I'm going to turn on the checkbox to include selected photos because I did actually select them in this case. So I'll go ahead and click that button there to create the folder. And now once again, we have the after sunset and the before sunset. So how many of you had no idea that all this folder and photo management was capable inside of Lightroom? Well, I'm glad at least half of you. That's good. Makes me feel better about showing you these things. All right, so let's talk about some metadata issues. We'll talk about a few of those metadata issues. A couple anyway. So pick flags. I mentioned the XMP sidecar issue in that I can actually write metadata out to the photos automatically. How wonderful and amazing is that? However, not everything's included, and I specifically mentioned pick flags. Now, personally, I don't like pick flags anyway. One of the reasons I don't like pick flags is that it's a non-standard piece of metadata, and so it doesn't go out to my photos, etc. Other software, including Adobe Bridge. You assign pick flags in Lightroom. You save your metadata out to the photos themselves. Adobe Bridge still cannot show you pick flags, even though both applications written by the same company. So pick flags, I don't care for that reason. Also, pick flags, it's a pick or reject. Well, I don't really like the idea of rejecting any of my own photos. It feels a little harsh. And maybe they're not like my favorite favorites, but they're not like bad and deserve to be rejected. Or at least that's what I like. You might feel differently about my photos. But I don't like the whole yes versus no approach to sorting through my photos. I like to have kind of a range of maybes, essentially. And especially for me. Now, admittedly, I'm in a unique situation because I'm primarily an educator, you might say, and I need lots of less than perfect photos purely for, no, you laugh, for illustrative purposes. I take my real picture first, and then I stop and think, how can I turn this into a learning opportunity for my students and take a less than perfect photo? And it's difficult sometimes. Like I have to try and, sometimes I forget how to make a bad exposure or like how to put it out of focus and things like that. But I put in that extra effort because I care about you guys so much.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
We appreciate it.
Yeah. And so some of those images are going to get a lower star rating, but I'm still going to use them for educational purposes because I love you. Yes and no to me then doesn't really work as well because some images are sort of maybe. Look, I'm never going to hang it on the wall, but I might use it in an article, kind of a travel article, where I want to show you an overview of what the place looks like, give you a little bit of a flavor, and then look at some of the beautiful things that you can find there. So not every image has to be a masterpiece to be useful for some purpose. Plus, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, so there's that. So I don't like the yes-no thing, and so I don't like using pick flags. I'd rather use star ratings when it comes to identifying my favorite or not so favorite images. Here, though, I've got some pick flags. So maybe now, after I've given you this explanation, you might be thinking to yourself, hypothetically speaking, you know what, he's right. Now I don't like pick flags either. I'm going to start using star ratings, but what about all the old stuff that has a star rating, or sorry, that has a pick flag assigned to it? You can see here, I've got some images with pick flags. Those are my, acceptable photos. So I'm going to assign a star rating. We'll talk about the specific approach I use to star ratings in just a moment, but first I need to figure out how am I going to switch things up here? Well, this is easy. So easy. All I need to do is filter images based on pick flag and then assign a star rating to all of them. Pretty straightforward. Well, I'm going to scroll up to the top of the left panel in the catalog section. I'm going to go to all photographs. All photographs. So now I'm seeing every single image in my entire Lightroom catalog, a whopping 139 photos in this case. My real catalog at home has got just over 300,000 photos, all 5-star rated. No, it's really just select all, 5. Yeah, it's really easy. So I've got all photographs in the catalog displayed. Now I just want to filter. I could go up to the library filter bar, and I can use the attribute option here, for example. I have the same basic set of controls at the top right of the film strip if I want to use that filter. Either way is perfectly fine. And I'm just going to say, show me all of the images that have a pick flag. Now, if I had used both pick flags and star ratings, do I want to eliminate the existing star rating? No. Now what am I going to do? What if some photos have both a pick flag and a star rating, and I'm planning on just giving all of these images the exact same star rating? I'll talk about which one in just a moment. Well, let's also specify that I only want to see images where the rating is equal to no stars. And I've got the unlabeled, I'll turn that off. So now flagged photos with 0 stars. So if an image has an existing star rating, then I'm not going to replace the star rating. Of course, then I need to do a new filter where I just remove any pick flags that remain after that. I'll mention that in a moment. So now I've got my images now that I want to assign a star rating to. Right now, they've got a pick flag, but not a star rating. Well, there's a couple of approaches that I could take here. Based on this filter, I could switch to the loop view, and I could go one by one by one through the photos. That's a 5-star, that's a 5-star, that's a 5-star, that's a 5-star, that's a 5-star. That. Eventually, though, you start to realize, you know, it'd be faster if I just select all and 5. But I could assign individual, okay, that one's a 3, and that one's a 2, and that's a 1, and, you know, et cetera, right? So I could go through, but I'm lazy. I don't want to be bothered with that if I don't have to. So my personal preference would be to work in the grid view because I want to apply a change to multiple images at the same time, and that requires the grid view. If you're in the loop view, even though you've got the film strip displayed and you've got multiple images selected, you can even see on the film strip that multiple images are selected. It doesn't matter, because you're in the loop view. I call this the loop view snafu, because it rhymes. Thank you for that one chuckle. If I'm in the loop view, Lightroom assumes, because I'm looking at one image, that I'm only working with one image, and so if I make a change, I will only want to affect one image. But that's not the way I was thinking. I was selecting multiple images. I have selected multiple images on the film strip. I'm going to assign a star rating. I want it to affect every single image on the film strip. Lightroom doesn't work that way. I need to switch to the grid view. And so I recommend when you're working with multiple photos that you actually select the multiple photos using the grid view just to avoid this issue in the first place. Yes, there is an option to synchronize metadata down here at the bottom right. I don't generally like to take that approach because it's prone to mistakes. You synchronize keywords, etc. So again, just making sure that I'm in the grid view. I've selected, in this case, all of the images based on my filter criteria. And now I'm going to assign the same star rating to all of these photos. Which star rating will it be? Thank you. 3. That's 5. Who said 5? Lynn. Thank you. I knew I could count on someone. Who said 1? It's the right answer, but I'm... And 1 star. So I take actually an unusual approach, well, what I think is an unusual approach. Soon it's going to be the standard approach for everyone once everybody hears about it. The standard approach to star ratings, and that is 1 star, let's put it like this. If a restaurant has a 1-star rating, are you going to eat there? No. If a restaurant has a 5-star rating, I can't afford it, so we opt for a 3-star. Well, to me, what's the point of assigning a 1-star photo to something you're never going to use? Why waste the calories?
It differentiates it from 0 stars.
Differentiates it from 0 stars, that's fair. If you don't sort through every single photo, then obviously that could become an issue. But I go through all my images, and so this approach works for me. And that is 1 star equals acceptable. Represents a keeper, an image I think I might use for some purpose. Not my best work necessarily, and so when I'm assigning my star ratings, I actually try to take multiple passes on my images, partly to separate out the emotion of that process. I'll talk about that in the second session today if you're going to stick around for that. But I use 1 star as my baseline, and the first time I'm reviewing my photos, it's either 1 star or nothing. And then I try to wait a little while, maybe a week, if possible, depending on my deadline. Sorry, wedding photographers, you don't get that luxury. But I'll go through a second pass and I'll upgrade some of my favorite photos to a 2 or 3-star rating. Obviously with a qualitative difference indicated by that rating. And it's not until I've worked an image in the develop module, maybe shared it online to see how many likes I get on Facebook, make a print, etc., then I'll start to develop a sense, after having lived with the image a little bit, is this an image that I really, really love, or is it maybe not as good as I thought it was? In other words, does it deserve that ultimate 4 or 5-star rating? Because of that approach, right now, I really only want to assign a 1-star rating to these images. Maybe some of these are 5-star images. Maybe some are 3, etc. That's a separate review process. Again, I could do that. I could go through one by one and decide what rating to assign, but for now I'm just going to assign a 1-star rating. So in your case, if you don't use my weird approach that's going to soon become the standard approach that everyone will want to use, then you might assign a 3-star rating, sort of that middle rating. You know it's a possible image, but it's not necessarily one of your favorites, etc. The point is that we're just mapping a pick flag to a star rating. All I've got to do is press the number 1 on the keyboard, and all of my photos magically disappear. Am I the only one that finds this a little disconcerting? You change an attribute and boom, there go all your photos. Like I just said, I like these by adding a 1-star rating, and they disappeared because of my filter criteria. And so now if I said rating equals 1, we'll see that all these images actually have a pick flag plus a star rating. But more importantly, in this case, I'm simply going to turn off the option. So basically I'm going to set is greater than or equal to no stars, which equals everybody, basically turning off that star rating filter. So now I have all of the images with a pick flag visible. So once again, I'm over in all photographs under catalog on the left panel in the library module, and I've set my filter criteria to indicate that I want to see images with a pick flag. So right now I'm seeing images that either did not have a star rating until just moments ago when I've sort of traded in my pick flags for a 1-star rating. It also includes images that I had previously assigned a star rating to and added a pick flag to. In either case, personally, I don't want the pick flag anymore. It's just going to confuse me. I've replaced pick flags with star ratings, so now I want to unpick these images, not reject. That's way too harsh anyway. I'm just going to press the letter U. I'm going to select all images, press the letter U to unpick. So if you're a pick flag user, P for pick, U for unpick, X for reject. But you could just select all of those images with a pick flag and unpick.
Is that one for stars too?
Same, no, U is only for pick flags versus reject flags. If you have a tendency to second guess yourself, you might not want to do these 2 steps right back to back. You might want to assign the star ratings, wait a little while, and then say, yes, this is working for me. Now I'll go back and remove all of those pick flags. So I'll go ahead and set that none option, and as we scroll through briskly, you'll see no pick flags at all, and the random star ratings here and there. Alrighty, on the subject of metadata, which folder is it? This one. Somewhere in here, here we are, images with color labels. I'm going to hide my panels here for a second. So you're probably already familiar with color labels, at least the fact that they exist. So we can add a label. What do color labels mean? Well, red means something. Yellow also means something. Green, blue, purple. What they mean, I don't know. It's up to you. And that's the interesting thing about color labels is there's really no inherent meaning. Originally there actually was. It was a priority flag. It's an IPTC metadata field, and it represented priority. So if you think about in the journalistic world, red, very important. On the cover, above the fold, get it out today, stop the presses, all that fun stuff. Yellow, maybe not so important. Purple, someday maybe we'll get around to putting that on the back page somewhere. Like retractions and stuff like that. So we got these color labels. You can only assign a single color label to any individual image. That sounds bad at first, except we can only assign one star rating or one pick flag, so it makes sense. Which color label do you want to assign? And you get to decide what it means. You just have to be a little bit careful because, for example, you might say, well, red means an image needs to be retouched, and yellow means an image needs to be printed, and green means something else. Well, what about an image that needs to be retouched and printed? You can't assign both at the same time. So you have to be thoughtful if you're going to use color labels. More important, Interesting, there appear to be some white color labels. I don't remember white being an option. Red, yellow, green, blue, purple. No white. So what's going on with white? Funny story. Unless you've already started using color labels and have made a mess of things. But we're going to fix it. Funny story. You see, once upon a time, there was a piece of software that allowed you to assign color labels to your images, metadata values. And then once upon a later time, there was another piece of software. Now, both of these software tools were made by the same company. I'm not going to name names. But the first product used one definition for color labels, second product another. You see, because truth be told, color labels, they're not really colors at all. They're presented as colors, sometimes. They're presented as colors, but they actually don't represent a color per se. They represent a word in metadata. What word? I'm glad you asked. So if we go up to the metadata menu in Lightroom, you can find color label set. Now, again, I'm not going to name names, but we have this option called Bridge Default, and we have an option called Lightroom Default. Let's go into the Edit option. So a color label actually represents a word in metadata. Which word? Well, we can look it up right here. So in the case of Lightroom, if you add a red color label to an image, keyboard shortcut currently set to the number 6 on the keyboard. You have the Control versus Command option as a preference setting if you like. So if I add a red color label to a photo in Lightroom, it will put into that applicable IPTC metadata field the word red. Interesting choice. If I assign a yellow color label, it will put the word yellow. You see where this is going. Well, it's right here in front of you, so I guess it's pretty easy. Green, blue, purple. Very, very simple. That makes perfect sense. If I were a software engineer, that's probably what I would do too. Now no, I shouldn't even mention them. I won't even refer to them categorically. We're just going to switch to the Bridge Default option, which could mean anything. You might notice in the background some of my white color labels have changed to a different color, and my colored color labels have changed to white. And that's because I changed the definition of color labels inside of Lightroom. And I've chosen this option that is just labeled Bridge Default for no apparent necessary reason, where we find that in a certain earlier software application, which still exists to this day, and they still haven't changed it, if you add a red color label, the IPTC metadata field for that color label, the word select is added to it. Yellow gets second, green gets approved, I don't know why it doesn't get third, blue gets review, and purple is to do. I'm sure this made lots and lots of sense to someone at some time. I just haven't had the pleasure to meet them and get the explanation. It's just not what I would have done personally. And so I make use of the Lightroom default option. Notice again, when I switch the option, the labels change because it's just a word in metadata. So when I look at an image in Lightroom, Lightroom says, oh, hold on a second. Let me go look at this field. I mean, it does it a lot faster than I can explain it. And it looks and it says, oh, I see the word yellow is in the IPTC field for the color label. Hold on a second. Let me go look in that dialog it does it so fast you can't even see it show up. And it looks at what that yellow color or that green color word means and which color it should display, and boom. Okay, it doesn't really have to go through all those permutations, but the point is that it's all connected. So if you had it disconnected, if you used, let's just say Adobe Bridge, to assign color labels in the past, and then you import those photos into Lightroom, guess what color labels are going to show up inside of Lightroom? White ones, even though they were red, yellow, green, blue, purple. And if you assign color labels in Lightroom, things are going to be a mismatch. So let's clean things up. Number one, I want to make sure that I'm working with the Lightroom default option, but I might want to make a note of the Bridge default options just so I know what those words translate into. For our purposes, we're not going to worry about accuracy right at the moment because that'll take too much time. And I'm lazy. But just bear in mind, select was red, second is yellow, and approved is blue, purple is to do. So we'll try to remember those. In fact, since you're all here, you guys memorize those, and then when I mention the word, you can tell me the color. That's going to be way better for me. So I've got my option here in the Edit Color Label set established at Lightroom default, the logical approach. Now I want to fix things so that the images have the correct color label assigned to them. But how am I going to figure out what's what? Now, theoretically, I would want to do this for everything. So I would go to all photographs. So for every single image in my catalog, I think that was the only folder that contained any images with different color labels, but let's just be thorough here. And I'm going to go to my metadata option under library filter. So the library filter is available within the grid view display, and we can get to it by choosing View, Show Filter Bar from the menu, or you see the keyboard shortcut there, backslash. As long as you're in the library module, you can just press the backslash to hide or reveal. And I'm going to hide or reveal images based on metadata. And you can see that I already have a label option that translates to color label as my final column. So I'm looking at all dates, all cameras, all lenses, and all color labels. If this were not set to label, I could choose it from the pop-up. So I want to see label here. And now I've got approved. What color was that? Green. Oh, you guys are good. So I'm going to go to approved. I'm filtering based on all images with an approved color label. And so now how do I assign that color label, which is green? So red, yellow, green, 6, 7, 8. So easy. Until we get the purple, then we're in trouble. So I press, oops, I hope I hit 8 there. Did I hit 8? I did, good. So press 8 on the keyboard to assign that green color label. We'll show you how we work around this momentarily. So approved now has 0, green, red, review. Anyone? What color was that?
Blue.
No, was it?
It's white.
Well, it's white now. Was it blue? I'm going to take your word for it. And what is blue on the keyboard? Happens to be the number 9. So again, red gets 6, yellow gets 7, green gets 8, blue gets 9. Sorry, I'm having trouble counting now. And purple gets, sorry, we're out of numbers. That's what it gets. But we'll show you how we can do that. So second, that was yellow, wasn't it? We think. See, now we'll just make it up as we go. So select was red, correct?
Yes.
But again, you can see that I'm just choosing my filter criteria based on these words from metadata and then assigning the appropriate. I could obviously go back and pull up that dialog each time if I need to. I could write it down, but I'd rather have you guys help me out. All right, so we got yellow. No label at all, that's fine. I thought we had one that was going to get purple, but purple was to do. If we have an image that needed that purple label, we don't have a keyboard shortcut, there's a bunch of options, but we can right-click, for example, and set the color label there. We can go to the menu, so a bunch of different options. We also can have a control. Do I have it enabled? No, I don't. But there's a control here for label. If we're back in the color label right here on the pop-up, so I can enable the display of the color label field down here on the toolbar. So a bunch of different ways to assign those color labels. I generally prefer keyboard shortcuts, which is why I never use the purple color label, because it has no keyboard shortcut assigned to it. I actually don't use color labels all that often, but they are, handy for assigning attributes. I will use the green color label, for example, to mark images that I want to share with someone that I don't necessarily otherwise need. Maybe it has a star rating, maybe it doesn't. So if you take a workshop with me and I happen to take a picture of you during that workshop, I'm going to mark it with a green color label, and at some point I will then send you a copy of that photo. So situations where I want to share a photo with someone, that's just something that I've adopted over the years. You can come up with your own definitions. But again, the key thing there is to keep in mind that those color labels sort of have an arbitrary definition insofar as it's just a word in metadata that relates to some specific color being presented in Lightroom. I shouldn't even say if you've made a mess. If you have used two different software applications at different times to work with your images, and those software applications have made a mess of your photos through no fault of your own, you can correct it right here inside of Lightroom. Again, just by filtering based on those words. So for example, the word select, which was used for a color label, and now I've filtered the images based on that select color label definition. I've assigned the actual color in Lightroom, so now it got whatever select used to be. I think that was red. And so now I can see, for example, the images that have a red color label. So pretty straightforward. I just wish that it was not an issue at all in the first place. All right, so let's take a look back and reference, yada, yada, yada. We're good there. So one more thing before we switch to this catalog issue, and that is renaming. I'm just referencing back to make sure I talked about everything I wanted to talk about. Some of the stuff that's included in the course I mentioned, the Gray Learning course on resolving organizational issues in Lightroom, there's more stuff there than I'm talking about here today, so there's a few additional things that you can find in that course if you're so inclined. But let's take a look at renaming. So we've got, we'll just go to the Palouse folder here, for example. I've got a set of images, and they have these wonderful file names. In this case, _MG_7689. How did it get that lovely file name? Well, it should have been IMG_. That would be the normal file name, except at least on most Canon cameras, if you change the color space from sRGB to Adobe RGB, instead of being IMG_, it starts with _MG_. I'm sure somebody finds that really helpful. I just find it a little confusing. But I actually don't find these file names to be all that helpful in the first place. For one thing, I don't need an _MG_, let alone an IMG_ as the first four characters. I'd be perfectly happy with an 8-digit serial number of sorts, because with only 4 numbers, I can only get up to 9,999 photos before I'm back to number 1. And that can be a little bit of a challenge in some cases. Number 1, I might end up with duplicate file names in the same folder. Lightroom works around that, but it adds parenthetical notes to the file name, which can be, I think, a little bit distracting and annoying. And so I'd rather use custom file names. Now, ideally, you would have renamed your photos on import, because then you get past this whole duplication. Just make sure to use enough digits, so you can use a 5 or a 6-digit number, for example, sequence number if you want. You can use your own custom structure. We're going to do a pretty straightforward, we're going to take a pretty straightforward approach here, but we're going to make use of, well, in this case, probably the same number of digits, but just something more meaningful. And I would say that file name duplication, probably not the biggest issue in the world. I mean, I have 300,000 plus images in my Lightroom catalog. I can go up to 9,999 images before it's back to image number 1. So let's just call it 10,000. So 300,000 divided by 10,000 is how many? 30? 30? Okay, I'm just making sure because I don't have a calculator on me. So 30, which means for every single file name, in theory, there's actually 30 copies, not copies, but 30 other photos with the exact same file name, except actually it's worse. Because how often do I get up to 9,999 so that it resets back to 1? Sometimes I reset the numbering. Like when I do a time lapse, I'll reset the numbering. When I buy a new camera, it's resetting the numbering of sorts. And so there's actually going to be more than 30 that have image number 1, for example. But in any event, I want something more meaningful, not just because of that potential for duplication, but also to have something more meaningful if I send a photo to someone else. So do I want someone to say, oh, hey, Tim, I really love that picture of the late afternoon light viewed from Steptoe Butte in the Palouse. Can you send me that? Oh, yeah, just tell me what the file name is. And they say, oh, yeah, it's line, upside down W, G, line 7698 period CR2. And I'm like, what? What was that? Wouldn't it be way better if they said, oh, it's Palouse 2015-2, something like this. Or, little branding tip, little subliminal advertising idea for you. Feel free to use this, no additional charge. I could put something like, Tim Gray is the best photographer ever, Palouse, image number 2. Just a little, give that some thought.
That's actually,
I mean, you don't have to go quiet, maybe not that long. Like, Tim Gray is great, or, maybe try and make it more succinct, maybe with a rhyme. What was that?
just your name.
Just your name.
It's very common.
Yeah, but I like the embellishment, personally. But yeah, just, the name of your company,
Initials.
you're something to identify so that it's not just a photo, it's a photo you took. So, just to get some sort of branding in there. Even if it's your name, your company name, kind of try to sort of work in your website address or your online name or, whatever. Obviously, there's some limitations in there, but depending on platform. But anyway, so we want to rename these photos. Now, I could have renamed, so just for thoroughness, during the import process, we have the option, if we're copying photos, we can rename those photos during the import process. Generally speaking, that's when I would prefer to rename the photos. Some people prefer to rename later in their workflow so that if they delete images, then they don't have any gaps. So go through, delete your rejects, and then rename so that the numbering is continuous. I don't tend to delete photos, mostly just because, of course, that implies rejects, and we already covered that, didn't we? So I'm going to go to the library menu and choose rename photo. So I could rename later for a variety of reasons. In this case, for example, maybe it's just a matter of deleting some images, or maybe I just forgot to rename during the import process, or I couldn't think of a good file name to use during the import process. So that brings up the rename dialog. Notice, even though I was in the loop view, even though Lightroom sort of thinks I'm working with one image, it does recognize that I've selected, in this case, 24 images, and that I'm going to rename all of those. Not a bad idea. It's nice that that dialog shows us how many images are being renamed. And so you can just kind of do a quick little check. Wait, 24. You can even look down below and see that 24 photos exist in this folder. And then after the slash, right down here, that 24 selected, so you can kind of just double check that that's all of the photos in the folder. It's really, I'm just trying to reinforce a lot of this attention to detail stuff, because that's usually where we start to get into trouble, where we just click and accept the license agreement and don't realize what we've done to ourselves in the process. Like reading the rules for photo contests, anyone? Okay. So what is our file naming going to be? This is very similar. It's actually identical to the renaming option that's available during the import process. It's just presented in a slightly different way. I like to use, generally speaking, custom name plus sequence. It just makes sense. Give it a word, give it a number, something descriptive. So custom name sequence. The only problem is, I'm not one to complain, as you probably picked up on by now, but the sequence number, when they say number, they mean number, as in 1 digit. Now, in fairness, when it gets up to 10, it will start using 2 digits. Lightroom will start using 2 digits. And when it gets up to 100, it'll start using 3 digits. The problem is they won't have leading zeros. So if you sort by file name, oops, they're not sorted in file name order, at least not the way you think of the file names. The sequence numbers won't be listed in the correct order. I'm sure that made sense to someone nowhere. So I'm going to click the pop-up once again. I've selected custom name sequence. It'll just become the default. But I'm going to choose edit so I can go in there and change things. This brings up the file name template editor dialog. Slightly overwhelming, perhaps. But basically, all we're doing here is defining a structure based on tokens, if you will. So I've got custom text, dash, and a sequence number. And you can see right above there, at the moment, that custom text is just untitled, -1. And we're going to replace it with Tim Gray's a great photographer, -1. But I can change the structure. So you'll see all these various options down here. I know it looks like kind of a lot going on. This is just a way of presenting the various elements that you can use in the actual file name. So I can use date. Maybe you want to put your name, year, month, day in a sequence number, for example. Whatever works for you. You can put the lens focal length. You think I'm joking? You think I'm joking? Let's go find it. No, is it on the other second pop-up, I think? Yes, here it is. You can put the lens focal length plus the exposure bias plus whether or not the flash fired and the serial number of your camera plus the sequence number. Feel free to use that specific sequence. I didn't trademark it or anything. So lots and lots of options. I'm sure we laugh, right? Because it's so funny, I hope is why we're laughing. But medical, yes. Advertising, bird photographers. Anybody? No bird photographers? Just not willing to admit it. Just one in the room. For bird photographers, the lens focal length actually can be a key factor in determining which image is which. You're going to take very different pictures with a 600 millimeter lens versus 24 millimeter lens, for example. So it's silly and funny, but actually there are situations where some of this information might be useful to you, depending on what type of photography you participate in. But for me, I like to keep it really, really simple, just because otherwise I get confused. And so I'm going to change sequence number. But notice that sequence number here is a pop-up. So I've got custom text dash sequence number. It is a pop-up. So how many digits do I really need? I think 4 is usually fine, at least for one photo trip, I hope. I have exceeded that before. In Alaska, 8 days, and it was over 10,000 photos. In my defense, I did a couple of time-lapse sequences in the mix there, so it wasn't quite as crazy as it seems. But in that case, I could go to 5. But generally speaking, 4 is going to be plenty. That will become the default, but I could also save this as a new preset. So I can call this, like custom plus 4 digits or something like that. In this case, I'll just leave it as it is. Hit done here. What will be my custom text? Tim Gray, thank you. Yeah, maybe in this case, because humility is a quality I admire so much in myself, we will. He said modestly. I'm going to make Palouse 2013. You can see the folder name here is Palouse 2013. So I'll make it Palouse-2013- sequence number. Now I don't have to type the dash here because remember that was part of the template structure itself. And you can see even a preview. Let's just double check down below the example. Palouse-2013-0001. Wonderful. One last thing. What's our starting number? Well, of course, 1. I don't have to put the leading digits in there, the leading zeros in there. We already specified we want 4 digits, so that part's fine. But probably I want 1. Do I always want 1? Not necessarily. Maybe you renamed the first batch of photos and you forgot to rename the second batch, so you're selecting a partial set of the photos. Generally, obviously, it would be 1. It doesn't necessarily have to be. Worth noting, by the way, if you're renaming late in your workflow process, and you've got, maybe you had some gaps in the numbering, et cetera, then you have to consider, is it possible that someone else has already seen this image based on the out-of-the-camera file name? And if so, you might want to include that file name as part of your renaming structure. So it might be like, Tim Gray is the greatest photographer ever, and I love attending all of his classes at B&H Photo, and then buying some really great gear, dash, original file name. And actually, in that case, you don't even need the sequence number because theoretically, at least, unless you've reset back to 0 somewhere during that shoot, that's going to take care of itself. But you could also have a sequence number just to be on the safe side if you're so inclined. So just something to be aware of. All right, have we had enough of this catalog? Great, let's go to another catalog. Well, I should have mentioned earlier, maybe I already mentioned earlier, my personal preference is to use a single catalog for all of my photos. One catalog for all of my photos. Why? Because I don't like to think. I don't want to have to try and figure out, wait, which catalog was it? So I know some photographers, for example, who create a separate Lightroom catalog for each calendar year. That will never work for me because I have to look at my phone to see what year it is this year, let alone trying to remember what year it was last week. And so for me, that's just not going to work at all. to try and open up a catalog to go find specific photos. And again, in some cases, for some photographers, maybe that makes sense. That's awesome. It just doesn't work for me. In theory, I've heard people say, photographers say, they use a separate catalog for their commercial work versus their personal work, like their family photos and stuff. But what's the difference between commercial and personal? Commercial means it's for sale. Personal means it's not for sale. Like you wouldn't be willing to sell one of those pictures for the right price, right? So to me, it's all one bucket. It's all pictures I took. Now, part of the reason I think that a lot of photographers use multiple catalogs in Lightroom is because in the early days of Lightroom, if you got up to about 30,000 pictures or so in your catalog, it basically wasn't usable. Literally, it was so slow that you had to have separate catalogs.
Has that improved?
Oh, that's improved dramatically.
That's why I
Again,
keep them separate.
I am lazy and not patient at all, and I use one catalog for all of my images, and it doesn't ever frustrate me.
How many do you have before it gets slow?
How many do you have before it gets slow? I don't know. I would say virtually none at this point. There are some subtle differences, but by and large, once you're inside of Lightroom and everything is kind of caught up with itself, perfectly fine. I've got 300,000 images. Now, here I am thinking, well, people probably don't believe me. Actually, I don't believe me. I should probably test this. And so there's a few little things where I've noticed Lightroom will be a little bit slow to populate the number of images in each folder, to switch to the develop module, certain little things here and there. Well, you know what, let me make another catalog. And I imported one folder of images with like 100 and some odd photos in that folder in a brand new Lightroom catalog. And I restarted my computer, and it was the exact same experience. So there's just certain little things that take a moment for Lightroom for whatever reason to do. But I would say that today, no problem at all with having a very large catalog. And to me, the advantages far outweigh the potential disadvantages. That's just me.
It takes a while to load up that catalog at first.
Yes, it takes, so what takes a little bit of time is to populate the numbers. So you see over in the folders list here, it gives me an indication of how many photos are contained in each folder. That takes maybe as much as a minute. In my case, I have lots and lots of folders, and I've got 300,000 images. My Lightroom catalog file, if I remember correctly, is something like 2 gigabytes in size. My previews file is something like 90 gigabytes in size. My hard drive is 4 terabytes, and it's getting pretty close to being full. It's a lot of data, but it doesn't take a significant amount of time, and it doesn't really slow me down. And especially once Lightroom's actually up and running, in other words, once all those fields are populated, then I don't notice any performance hit. So, but I do have multiple catalogs in this case. And I'm going to open up the second of those catalogs. And we're sort of going to cover a lot of bases here. So we're just going to take a look at the fact that the images here actually exist, that they actually, for example, this image has GPS coordinates associated with it. So if, just, because I'm a caring person, if you'd like to get pictures like this, you just have to go here. That's on the highway somewhere near Ljubljana, Slovenia. I do recommend, if you want these sort of photos, that you do this during the winter time. But so just friendly tip in case you're impressed for some reason by these photos. Let's see. Well, let's go ahead and we've got some adjustments assigned to some of these images. Let's just take this very first image, and I'll add some keywords, and we'll just call this Graz and Austria. Oops, Austria, if I can spell it right. So just to confirm, once we get into our other catalog, that this information actually made it. So I've got 2 different catalogs. This could be for a number of reasons. Maybe it's because you hadn't heard me say that you should only use one catalog, and then you weren't convinced, but then you heard me say it over and over, and you finally decided, okay, I'm going to give this a try. Or maybe it's because you're like me and you actually use multiple catalogs. What? Yes, I actually do use multiple catalogs, even though I only use one catalog. By which I mean, no, it makes sense. So believe, I'm going to dig myself out of this one. I have one master catalog. I have one actual catalog that I consider my real catalog. But when I'm traveling, I don't usually bring my big catalog with me necessarily. I certainly don't bring all of my 300,000 photos with me, at least on most trips. I prefer to have a single catalog just for traveling purposes. This is just the images from my current trip, and each night I review them and I assign star ratings, maybe some keywords, etc. When I get home, I want to merge that catalog into my master catalog. So I say that I only use one catalog mostly by way of embellishment. in my traveling workflow, I actually will use 2. But that traveling catalog is a temporary catalog that I then want to merge. Point being, there are a variety of reasons that you might want to merge multiple catalogs together. I actually have an article that covers exactly this topic in my Pixology digital magazine. Because you guys have been so nice to me today, if you would like a copy of that article, of that issue of Pixology, just send me an email, tim@timgray.com, Grey. You leave off "is the greatest photographer" part. Just tim@timgray.com. Send me an email requesting the issue that covers merging catalogs. I'm happy to send you a free copy of that. Just a warning, once you see this issue of Pixology, probably you're going to want to sign up and get it monthly, but we can help you with that too. So we've got these keywords. So I've got all this information. Now I realize I want to merge this catalog with my other catalog. Pretty straightforward. First, I go to that other catalog. In other words, I want to be working in my master catalog, or the catalog that will become my master catalog at the end of this process. So I'm going to go back to my master catalog. Notice that each time I switch catalogs, Lightroom has to quit and restart. So here I'm back in my master catalog, and I'm ready to merge. Well, that process of merging is actually pretty straightforward. You do need to be very careful. So if you're going to do this, you might, again, send me an email. I'll send you a copy of that article so you can check it out. It kind of goes through step by step, including some of the cautions that I recommend. But what we're going to use is the import from another catalog command. So I'm in my master catalog, and I'm going to import from any of my other catalogs, possibly copying my images all at the same time. All right? So import from another catalog. And Lightroom's going to say, okay, that's cool. I can help you with that. I mean, it doesn't, but I kind of like to think that it's polite that way. And I'm going to navigate to the location where that other catalog is located. So for our demo purposes today, it's just the second catalog, Photos 2. And so I navigate to the location where that catalog is stored. So if it had been on a laptop, maybe I copy everything onto an external hard drive and attach that to my desktop or whatever the case might be. Point being is I want the photos and the catalog available. So I'm just specifying the catalog, which is, as we mentioned at the beginning of the show today, the LRCat for Lightroom catalog file. So I'll choose that and double click or click the choose button. And it says, well, we've got some folders here containing multiple images. What would we like to do? So you can see that's in Photos 2, Austria 2014. What would we like to do with these images? Now in this case I've made things a little bit messier because my photos are contained in folders on my desktop, etc., as opposed to maybe 2 separate external hard drives. We'll let that go for the moment. How do we want to deal with that? Well, I could just add the images where they are, leave the images where they are, and just add them to my existing Lightroom catalog. For me personally, generally, if the photos were somewhere else, I want to move them or copy them to that location where all of my images are stored. So if I was traveling with a smaller hard drive, maybe I'm copying the photos then to my master hard drive, my big hard drive that contains everything. So in this case, I'm going to copy to a new location. I'll go ahead and choose that location, which will be right here in my Photos 1 folder. All right. So I'm just copying the photos from where they are to Photos 1, and I'm importing them into my catalog in the process. I'll go ahead and click the Import button. Now the import process itself, pretty simple, because it's just saying, okay, I know about these photos. It's taking the information from the second catalog and putting it into the first catalog, and then it's copying the photos to a new location. But again, bear in mind that because I had a slightly deeper folder structure than I normally would, that deeper folder structure has carried over in that copy operation. So you might notice here that I have a Photos 2 folder. Well, that's a mild inconvenience, but not really a problem at all. I can just select all of those folders. So click on the first one, shift click on the last one, and then I will drag, stop, and drop.
How come this has got dots on it? That's usually empty. It's got 14 photos in it.
The dotted arrow there, triangle, indicates that there's no subfolders. There are photos, but no subfolders. So I'm going to drag, stop, and drop into the correct location, confirm that I'm moving on the disk. So steps that we've performed earlier today, same basic process. Notice that they're still selected, they're still in alphabetical order, but now I have this empty Photos 2 folder, which I can just right-click and remove.
Does it
Does it take the metadata with it? What a silly question. Of course it does. Absolutely. So here's that first image. I added the keywords Graz and Austria. If we go back to the Slovenian drive, then we've got those images right back on the map, so I can click on my map position push pin and go to the map module and see that those images are on the map. I've got my GPS coordinates. I was at an elevation of 1,979.5 feet. And let's go back to the library module. I don't know if there was any other, I don't think I added any other metadata, custom metadata to these images. I mean, it has, mailing address and my email address and my phone number right there if you want to give me a call, 555-1212. It's right there in metadata. It must be true. My develop adjustments, so we can see, for example, this image had some adjustments applied, as did this one. This one had adjustments as well as some keywords. So this was in Austria, Vienna, in Heldenplatz. So all of that metadata has been retained as part of the process. And when I say all, in this case, I really mean all. Remember when we took advantage of the option to write our metadata out to the photos? And I said, well, there's some exceptions, pick flags and collections and history of what we had done in the develop module. In this case, there's no exceptions. It's Lightroom talking to Lightroom. It's a Lightroom catalog being merged with a Lightroom catalog, and so all of that information is retained. All of those photos were copied. Yes, I moved the photos into a different location once I got them to where I wanted them. Remember, that folder structure was a little more complicated than I really wanted, but the photos were actually copied. They still exist. So there's photos 2, and here's photos 1, and you can see there's some duplication. I have Austria and Slovenia in both locations. I have a catalog in the second location. Well, that makes this photos 2 folder duplicative and obsolete. And so we can delete it. Yes?
We can.
Yes, you can. But not me. Because I'm paranoid and nervous. And so no way. What about once I've performed my synchronization backup of my primary photos drive so that now I've got that at a second location, and I've done that same synchronization to a second backup hard drive, so now I have 3 copies, well 4 counting this, and I've even taken that second backup copy and put it in my bunker over at my storage unit. Then will I delete this folder? No. Because I'm weird. Because I don't like, I developed these habits so I don't have to think about this stuff. Plus, I'm paranoid. But I don't have to think about these things. I don't delete until I need hard drive space. I start filling up a hard drive that's got a bunch of backup stuff on it, and then I can go through and say, oh, well, I've got 3 copies of those photos. I can get rid of this. It's definitely redundant, et cetera, et cetera. But I like to just keep it around. However, I certainly don't want to get confused any more than I already am. Remember, this photos 2 location. In this case, I'm using a folder on the desktop. Normally, it might be an external hard drive, of course. It contains a Lightroom catalog. Lightroom knows about that catalog because I've opened it recently. I could go open it. And then I open it for no good reason, and I'm looking at my photos and say, oh, I should add another keyword. Not realizing that I'm working in the wrong place. So to avoid that, what I like to do then is just rename. And my personal approach is just to add the word backup in all caps at the beginning of any folder or file name, etc., that in theory I could delete, but I'm going to take an extra cautious approach. And now, when I go into Lightroom and I go up to the menu and say open recent, yeah, please open that Photos 2 catalog, hey, I can't find it. And I'm going to say, what? Oh, right. Okay. Whew, that was a close one. Right? So it's just that extra step. Now, in theory, maybe there's some issue like, hey, I think some metadata is missing. I want to go open that catalog. I could still go to the File menu and choose Open Catalog, navigate to that location. But hopefully that never becomes necessary because now I've merged everything. I've got everything all in one place. And thanks to having cleaned up the folder structure and cleaning up those pick flags and those color labels and renaming and all these other things, hopefully now I'm never going to be confused, and more importantly, I'll be able to find any photo that I need exactly when I need it without spending that hour. And usually, when I can't find a photo, and it takes me a long time to find a photo, eventually when I do find the photo, I realize the mistake I made. And then I'm more careful not to make that mistake in the future. But now you have the benefit of being able to learn from all of my stupid mistakes so that you don't have to go make those mistakes yourself, and you'll always be able to find your photos. So thank you guys very much. I appreciate you hanging out with me.
Whether you're a hobbyist or a professional, B&H has the answers to your questions. Experience a world of technology at our New York City Superstore. Connect with us online or give us a call. Our staff of experts is happy to help.